Hello, beautiful people. My name is Emma.
And I'm MC.
And we are your hosts of the G-Forces podcast. So, today we watched the Chinese Grand Prix. Not live because we need sleep.
Yeah, it was a start time of 2 a.m. here, you guys, and it wouldn't have happened. We would have
No, I
lost
think
our
if we lived in
minds.
on the West Coast, we probably could have stayed up because that's how Japan is for us, where Japan starts at midnight.
Yeah.
Japan, actually, now that I think about it, Japan, you're watching Japan alone.
Yeah, it's gonna kind of suck, but that's okay.
Yeah. Well, I'll watch it still,
deprived. Too. Yeah, no, but Emma's going global.
Yes.
Anyways.
It was a crazy weekend, to be honest.
I think that there was some things that definitely need improvement and we're still befuddled by. And then, obviously super thrilled with some of the wins throughout the weekend. I mean, we saw Lewis kind of make history with the sprint, and then, I think McLaren is really showing, that they are on top right now.
At least for right now.
For right now. And that's the thing. It's still really early days. I mean, after the race, we were looking at the standings and just kind of like laughing. Not at the teams, but just kind of like where everything's shaking out.
It's all very unexpected right now. Like, the current standings is not what it's normally at. Like, last year going into the race season, we knew that, like, Max was going to be on top, and finding out that this is the first time that Max hasn't led the driver standings since, 2022 or something like that is crazy.
Yeah, it's early days, but China definitely brought some craziness.
100%. Well, we are going to try to break this up as best as we can and just kind of go over everything. So because there's a lot to talk about, we're just going to get right into it. So we are first going to start to go over the track info.
All right, so the official race name for this weekend was the Formula One Heineken Chinese Grand Prix 2025. Wait, no, it's not.
I think it was Lenovo? Or was Heineken?
That was 2024.
No, I think it was Heineken.
Was it?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't think it really matters what brand
is
the main sponsor of the race weekend.
The circuit name is the Shanghai International Circuit, and there are 16 turns on this race course. The length is 5.41 kilometers or 3.387 miles, and they're doing 56 laps around this track. The race distance is 305.066 kilometers or 189.55 miles. And the lap record, which I know was broken during the sprint, but I don't think they deem it as, because they take the lap record from the race.
I think the lap record was from... So, okay, they take the lap record from the race, but then I think Lewis just happened to put down the fastest lap that's ever happened in Quali. Like, he did it in Quali. In sprint Quali.
Yeah.
And it happened to be the fastest one that's ever happened on the track.
But the lap
then Oscar
record,
did too, I think.
But the prior, we had to look into it, but the previous lap record, if it's been changed, I don't know, I'll have to double check, was placed in 2004 by Michael Schumacher in a Ferrari, and he did it in a minute 32.238 seconds. We were seeing 130s and 131s, and we'll get into that in a second. But there are 2 DRS zones at this racetrack. DRS detection zone 1 is between turns 11 and 12, and activation begins at the very, very long straight between 13 and 14. And then DRS detection zone 2 is right before turn 16, and then activation begins after turn 16 and that additional start-finish straight. For those that haven't looked at a track map, China is known for these 2 really drastically long...
It's crazy.
Straights, as well as a few insane there's a hairpin turn between the 2 straights. It's just
Turn 1 is the most insane thing I've ever seen on a
Yeah, it's
racetrack.
definitely like a crazy
Whoever designed this was like, ha ha ha.
yeah. So a reason why the times were different was kind of twofold, as well as just like, the cars are getting faster. So the track was repaved this year for a second year in a row. I think it just wasn't up to certain standards with Pirelli and FIA.
Yeah,
So
last year there was a ton of graining at the Chinese Grand Prix, and people really struggled with their tires. And I think there was even a point where Pirelli had come out with a statement after the Chinese Grand Prix saying, like, the graining that happened on the tires was so extreme, like, it wasn't supposed to happen. I think it was because the way that the track was, it was unexpected for what they had planned.
yeah, so it was repaved, and then it was just hot. It was really hot. I think during the first day of them on the grid, the track was ranging at like 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So
Yeah.
it was tough on the tires already. But a lot of the drivers were saying that it was grippy, so that's why they were able to get in those faster times. But that is the track that we were at.
Okay, now we are going to get into practice.
For those that aren't aware, this was the first sprint weekend of the season. So the weekend format is a little bit different, and they only have one practice session, which is normally like okay, whatever. But I think at this point, for some of the drivers, like Ollie, like Liam, that really need the lap times, especially the guys that have had like issues during their practice sessions last race.
Yeah.
I think the fact that they're only given that 1 hour of practice time, it's it doesn't help the fact
Yes,
that they
but at
don't.
the same time, they only get one practice session during
Well,
the F2 races.
so that's the thing. They're
So, yeah.
used to this format. They're very used to the fact that it's a 45-minute practice session and then straight into qualifying
Yeah.
for Formula 2. So it's no different, but I think it's just the fact that like they don't have as many laps in the car. But Liam Lawson and Alex Albon both experienced runs through the gravel towards the beginning of this session. Just again, very new repaved track
Yeah.
was gonna happen. The times look to be coming in a bit faster than last year, like we said. And then towards the end of the session, red flags were raised when Jax Alpine pulled off, and you heard his radio message to the team that he had lost power steering ability. So,
Yeah.
it was definitely frustrating. The good thing is that he was able to pull off in one of like the runoffs, so it didn't look like any damage was done to the car. It's just the fact that, you know, it's early in the season. There's just going to be like electrical issues and stuff like that.
Yeah, and especially with these flyaway races, when there's car issues in the European leg, it's a lot easier for them to get them fixed in between race weekends. But when we're in this first leg, when we are doing Australia, China, Japan, and then we go to some Middle Eastern countries, they tend to have less parts to repair cars with, and B, not like their full like spec of cars basically.
Well, the other problem too, and we didn't even touch upon this at the beginning, was the freight issues between
Oh
shipping
my gosh,
everything
yeah.
between Australia and China. And so these are uh air freighted, like professionally packed up. You'll like if you look it up, they go into it, but a bunch of the teams, I think like almost all of them got
There were four
affected.
teams.
4 teams got affected by just like freight issues.
And
They're
so
being
for
held up
four
in
teams, they
customs,
didn't
stuff
have
like
their
that.
cars right away. And so normally you have a curfew from like when you can actually work on your car, like the mechanics can actually build it. And they ended up for the four teams that cars they didn't get them until super late. They obviously all had to break curfew, which was allowed given the situation. So, but just a reminder, when it comes to power steering, the whole point of it is to basically make the car a little bit lighter for the drivers. In F2 cars, to my knowledge, you don't have power steering. So that's why it's such a drastic difference between F2 and F1 and the way that you're actually going to handle the car. Power steering does make it more manageable to just drive in general. If you don't have it, the car is going to feel like it's a million pounds heavier. And then when you're going into the turns, when you're hitting those G forces, when you're trying to make a turn, it's going to be significantly more difficult to make a turn. To my knowledge, I might be incorrect, but I believe this is correct. Indy cars don't have power steering. And so that's almost how you'll notice the difference in like literal build that the drivers have. A lot of the IndyCar drivers are a lot more almost like muscular and like stockier up top, like they are a bit more built, where the F1 drivers, their necks are far larger because they're having like basically far more G forces, and they don't have to have as much like arm muscle mass basically.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, you can definitely tell like a difference when you look between the two.
There's a
Um,
very obvious difference between an IndyCar driver and
and
F1
I think
driver.
that's to be expected in like most
They're different
motorsport.
sports.
Yeah. So the last note that I have for practice is that at the end the times came in and the McLarens were able to move up, Lando coming in first and Oscar coming in third. Charles was able to show a good time and was able to split the McLarens. So, just kind of a typical practice session. I feel like on sprint weekends, there's just not as much time for the teams if issues arise. A lot of these sessions are like, you know, not saying that missing a practice is not like important, but it's a lot less important than like a qualifying, and so this weekend just gets kind of like smushed together.
Yeah, and at least like last year, the rules were changed during sprint weekend. So in 2023, over a sprint race weekend, basically after once you had sprint quali, you could not work on your car at all. Like, so you had practice, and you basically had to make sure that your setup was perfect during
And
practice,
then it
and
was
then
hands
that
off.
was it. Or else you would get penalized. Where now you're allowed to work on your car, you can work on it between practice one and sprint quali, and then between the actual sprint race and regular quali, you're allowed to work on your car without any penalties, which I think is really important because having 1 hour sessions, sometimes not even that really, to try to figure out the setup of your car is a little bit difficult. So I think that that helped people a lot when they made that rule change last year, and that carries into this year as well.
Yeah.
Okay, we are going to go into sprint quali now.
In sprint quali, there are specific mandated tires for each qualifying section. So, sprint quali 1, mediums are mandated. So everyone had to come out on mediums. And I'm just gonna go through this because it's a significantly shorter session and just kind of like I'll just rapid fire through my notes. A few drivers had track limit issues, and this is something that we saw a little bit affecting drivers throughout, I think, both sprint quali and regular quali. Bortoletto and eventually Lawson were affected by this, having times deleted. Lewis is able to top the charts of the session in a later lap, followed by Lando and Charles. So knocked out of SQ1 was Jack Doohan, who was able to put in time. His car was back on the grid. Pierre Gasly, Esteban Ocon, Nico Hulkenberg, and Liam Lawson. I think
Sorry to interrupt, but one thing to note that people have been discussing a lot this weekend is Liam Lawson's performance,
I was about to
because
bring that up.
now this is the second weekend in a row where he is not performing to the expectations of Red Bull, which, let's be real, the expectations of Red Bull are to basically be as fast as Max, if not just below his speed. From what we do know, based off of interviews with Alex Albon and other people, the car for Red Bull is built in a way where it is just their idea is, I'm going to make the fastest car possible, and Max is just one of the insane drivers that's capable of driving something that is undrivable for others.
It's like, and the way everyone describes it is slightly different, where it's like it's difficult to drive, but then it's overly sensitive that like it's like it's so I think it's such a complicated vehicle to drive
Yeah.
that at the end of the day, like I do think that you've had multiple drivers who you don't believe are successful. And I think that a lot of fans, I mean, reading through Reddit, reading through socials, like a lot of people are kind of like, this is a bigger issue ingrained in Red Bull
Well, yeah.
beyond Liam Lawson.
Yeah. I mean, it was known last year that they just stopped listening to Checo, which I think they like blatantly said at some point. And because like Checo said, "Oh, I've been talking about these issues with the car since
And now Max
2023,
is feeling
and now Max
it.
is struggling,
Mhm.
and they're finally listening." And he was like, "I've been talking about this for over a year now, and they're finally listening, but not to me." And so it's clear that this is a very difficult car to drive. They've had several drivers over the years, and they still can't find the person to fit in that second seat.
I also think you are running a very dangerous game in terms of Max is not going to be on the grid forever, and he might not always be a Red Bull on the grid. Now, we've seen through past drivers that they all have, promises and things that they say to their teams, but I don't know. It's definitely a bigger issue at hand, and something, I know we say this about everything that, like, comes up dramatically, but I do think it's something to keep an eye on because we've been closely watching it since, like, really the beginning of last season, where it does feel like there's something, I'm just curious to see if they're gonna ever.
That seat is cursed.
The seat is cursed, but I'm also, like, their level of success, I'm just so curious where it's gonna go. But anyways, back to sprint quality.
What I was just gonna say really quickly before we continued on is that I don't actually I can't even remember what I was gonna say. It was regarding Liam Lawson not being able to drive the car, and I don't really even remember where I was going with this point because I had a point.
It'll come back to you.
Yeah, I'll talk about it at some point throughout the episode. Carry on.
Okay, so just as a reminder, knocked out was Jack, Pierre, Esteban, Nico, and Liam Lawson. So moving on to sprint qualifying 2, mediums are also mandated for this session. George seemed to be really discussing how he was struggling with the tires. And Lando and Oscar were able to put in some really good times early on. Alex set up an incredible first lap for himself, coming in 7th, securing that SQ3 spot. So that was really exciting to see, especially you guys know where we align with Williams.
It does seem that Carlos is struggling a little bit with the Williams and just trying to get adjusted. I do know that at the end of the actual main race, there was a radio between him and the team where he said, "I think I'm much faster than that," based off of his finish. And James Vowles' response was, "Yes, you are much faster than that, Carlos. Like, let's take a look at it and we'll figure it out."
Yeah. Carlos was knocked out, so knocked out of sprint qualifying 2 was Fernando Alonso, Ollie Behrman, Carlos, Bortoleto, and Isaac Hadjar. And I will say, you could tell that whatever they've done to the car, and we talk about this every season, upgrades or changes aren't always necessarily good, but they have to make them in order to see, it might work. It might improve. And so I think they probably just did something to the car. The car's been off because he didn't seem to struggle this much. But it's also a very different track.
Well, and it's also a very different car from a Ferrari.
Yeah.
And so Alex Albon has been driving this car. This is now his 4th season with Williams. And so he knows how the car works. Where Carlos, he's probably one of the most versatile drivers on the grid. We were saying earlier that we think that if there's a driver on the grid that could drive the car, the Red Bull, as well, closest to Max, it would be Carlos because he's been on so many different teams and driven so many different cars that, like, he might be able to be the only one who could adapt to it. But it's just, I mean, it's the second race weekend, and he didn't even get to do the race last weekend.
Yeah.
So, like, he's a leg down on everybody, so his speed is not going to necessarily be up to par with Alex, and that's okay. It takes time.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is too is I think that we're seeing excitement from Alex that we haven't seen in a while.
He's got a teammate to push him.
Yeah, and I think
for the first time ever.
And I think that there's like a confidence that he's bringing to the table that we haven't seen. And so I'm just excited cuz I think if one of them is being successful, they both can get there.
Yeah.
Knowing how good of a driver Carlos is. So sprint qualifying 3, there was a bit of an intense radio message that we heard after sprint qualifying 2, and at this point, you know, there's going to be some growing pains on Ferrari when it comes to team orders and swapping positions, and basically Charles's team asked him to swap positions during SQ2, and he was not very thrilled. And I just think that you're seeing new approaches.
I think that next race weekend, we need to have one of their, like, I think we almost need to have Lewis's or Charles's driver cam up, because there was another time that F1 TV showed the exchange between driver and engineer with Ferrari for both of them that made it seem like there was a lot more drama, but like they completely left out one of the conversations, and the context, the lack of context is going to throw off. It's given Drive to Survive sometimes.
Yeah. So for Sprint Quali 3, softs are mandated for this session, and unfortunately Lando did have a few mistakes that saw him unable to really successfully put in like a strong, clean lap. So Lando was kind of like down a leg for, I feel like, the sprint, like he wasn't.
Yeah, it wasn't his best.
It wasn't his best. Oscar was able to top the boards, but then Lewis was able to put in a great lap coming out on top, followed closely by Max bumping Oscar to third. And I think a lot of people got, the same energy of
2021.
Yeah, and a lot of people were just excited to see him get pole position, even though it's a sprint, but like the first technical pole position in a Ferrari.
Well, I think that this was the only good thing that happened for Ferrari this weekend.
Was the sprint.
We'll explain a bit more about that later, but I think that Lewis needed this confidence boost of getting pole for the sprint, and yeah, it's just a sprint race, and like the points are not as many and whatever, but like it's still, I think he needed it going into this new team, new race season. Like, he's had a couple seasons since the last time he won his World Drivers' Championships. I think he just needed that confidence boost.
Yeah, no, and I think it's good for the team too.
Yeah, definitely.
Just to kind of like be like, okay, like we can do this.
Yeah, 100%.
So that's all I have for sprint. I didn't write down the rest of the order. I don't know why.
It's fine.
But I think I've just like gotten to the point where I'm like, I just go off of the top names, which, sorry to everyone else.
You also can, to all the ones listening, you also
can
pull
look
it up.
Yeah.
That does exist.
But yeah, so want to get into the sprint?
Yeah, we're going to get into the sprint now.
The sprint is only 19 laps, so
the race was 56, the sprint was 19.
It was 19. So very nice, like a little taste of racing. And at the beginning, Nico was starting from the pit lane. I'm not sure what they did change to his car, but they broke parc fermé, so I'm assuming they modified something. All of the cars were on mediums, and I think it was just kind of the beginning of some of the mega tire issues that people were starting to have. Like we really saw with this like longer form
I think
of driving.
People did not expect the mediums to struggle as much as they did at some points.
Lewis was able to maintain the lead off the start, and
he had a fantastic start.
It is
the start that if you're P1 and Max is P2 or P3, the start that Lewis had during that sprint race is how you have to have your start go to make sure that Max does not pass you, or else Max will blow right through you in the start.
Yeah. Lando, unfortunately, did get a lockup, and got pushed even further down to P9. He had started at P6. Lewis was able to maintain a little distance of a gap between him and Max, and eventually Oscar was able to climb up on Max, which, I don't know, I think because we've been in this, like, Red Bull dominance for so long, it's, like, hard for me to fathom cars walking on, like, a Red Bull so easily, and you could just see Oscar because, and I get it, every year it's gonna be different, but I think they've just been so dominant that I, like, expect it to be as difficult as it has been in the
And
past.
it's Max.
Yeah. So Oscar was able to climb closer. Carlos seemed to really be struggling with the car, and I think he was the only person during the sprint to go in to switch tires. He was one of the few. It's 19 laps. People aren't going to pit. And this saw him drop back pretty far back. Towards the last six-ish laps, the cars all seemed to really be struggling. I mean, most people were complaining. A lot of people just the
tire on each car that seems to really struggle on this course and grain the most is the front left tire.
Yeah.
People say that one really is taking a hit. I think it just depends on how the turns are on a racetrack, and I think that this one, the front left, just takes a hit the whole time.
Yeah. By lap 15, Oscar was finally able to pass Max, and they had been kind of fighting on and off for a while, which was able to allow Hamilton to maintain and finish the sprint with a 6.889 second lead over Oscar in second.
Yeah.
Max ended up coming in third. George Russell came in fourth ahead of Charles Leclerc in fifth, with Yuki showing the strength of the V-carb in sixth. Kimi was able to score points coming in seventh, and Lando was able to secure that final point scoring position in eighth place.
One of the things that people were really shocked about with the sprint was basically how much Lando was struggling to just even move up the grid. He dropped back a bit, like Mary Catherine said, in the start, but with the speed of the McLaren over other cars, it was just surprising that he struggled, at least to the general consensus that he struggled.
I think we have talked about how bad the McLaren is in dirty air.
Yes, that's the thing. Oscar had enough. I mean, Oscar was kind of in dirty air, but, like, he also was a little bit in the slipstream of Max at points.
Mm-hmm.
And then once he passed Max, he was in clean air. Lando, the McLaren does struggle in dirty air, and we have said this over the last year or so. Lando does seem to struggle a bit more trying to pass a pack.
Yeah.
He takes a lot longer than Oscar does. Because I think that he's waiting for the perfect time, where Oscar is a bit more gutsy with his passes sometimes.
I think they've also both struggled to just pass in general, though. Like, we've had a lot of moments where it's like 10 to 15
sometimes it takes
laps,
so long for them to pass.
And I get it. Like, I don't have the experience of knowing how difficult it is to pass in a lot of the courses. Like, some of them, there's just, like, only one or two spots that you can. But I agree. I think that it's something that, you know, definitely struggles a bit more with the McLarens.
Yeah.
But that's all I have for the sprint. So it was short, sweet, and we saw Lewis Hamilton win.
Which was really nice to see Ferrari all happy and everything, and it's his first win-ish with Ferrari, and I think he definitely needed that given the rest of the weekend. So
yeah.
We're going to get into Quali now.
So qualifying is another one. I kind of have short, sweet notes. In Q1, softs appeared to be the tire of choice for the drivers entering this first session. Track limits were really affecting a lot of the drivers, as I stated earlier. I think Lando, Yuki, and Jack all had times deleted. Oscar was able to put in a leading time early on, but Max was able to move to the top of the charts after a successful run. And I think this kind of like showed the foreshadowing of like how successful Oscar was going to be. Um, Alex Albon continued to show his strength in the car and was able to get a P6 placement in Q1, which was just like crazy. Knocked out was Pierre, Ollie, Jack, Gabriel, and
Liam Lawson. I thought I remembered what I was going to say about Liam, and now I've forgotten it again.
Yeah, I think the way the pundits were talking about it, I think people are alluding to the psychology of it and the possibility of, like, I don't want to say it.
What, a switch?
No, the yips.
Oh, you can say it.
It's just so...
Well, because it looks like he's on... They kept saying that he's driving the car on, like, a knife's edge, basically. And that, like, the confidence that other drivers have with the car and feeling comfortable with it, if you watch his driver cam, he is not comfortable at all. And it seems like he's just trying to keep the car on track the whole time. And because of that, he has to slow down. And I think they said going into the last turn for, I think, Quali, he was 24 or 12 kph slower than Max.
Yeah.
Which just shows how he has to slow the car down so much more in order to keep it on track. I just think that seat, A, is cursed. B, I just think that, I don't know, I feel bad for the guy. I felt bad for Checo, even though I wasn't the biggest Checo fan. I felt bad for Checo. I feel bad. Pierre and Alex had the same issues with Red Bull.
The problem is that there is an ego from the people that make decisions about the drivers on Red Bull of once they lose faith in that person, faith is gone.
There's also like no nurturing.
Yeah, so
the only person that it seems like they've ever nurtured was Daniel.
Yeah, and I just think that there's like this energy that fans are just, I mean, you can see it. It's like wolves to like the feed. Like they're just waiting for Red Bull to make the decision. Well, and I think the reason why every time.
I think that's exactly why I think people are expecting it to happen, because Red Bull is brutal and ruthless, and they will remove you if you are not performing to the expectations immediately.
Yeah, I don't know if that's the direction of the sport anymore, though. Is that like...
No, it's not.
And I'm not saying, but I think that it's gotten so much more technical and engineering based, and I think that it's like data and long term and but yeah, I don't know, that it's for them to figure out.
Yeah,
they can.
It's definitely not an environment I would want to be in from the energy that we've
Absolutely
gotten.
Not.
Yeah.
Okay, so Q2 was pretty uneventful. Lando and Oscar were able to put in strong times early on along with Max, and the Ferraris for some reason just like didn't show the speed that they had during the sprint, coming both in P7 and P8. So I don't know what happened. I don't know if
they changed anything with the setup between
I don't know if they can.
The sprint and Quali.
Are they allowed to?
Yeah.
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 Knocked out of Q2 was Esteban, Nico, Fernando, Lance, and Carlos. Again, the top three towards the beginning consisted of Oscar, Lando, and Max, and they were all separated by 0.22 of a second. So, like, that just goes to show freaking
everything
fast.
Is so tight.
Lando did attempt another fast lap, but bailed out pretty unfortunately. I think he just made a mistake and it just wasn't worth it.
At the very end.
Yeah, and I think that was the thing too. Like, you can tell that the teams are still, like, it's the beginning of the season. They're still figuring it out and, like, trying to figure out strategy and timing. But yeah, so the top 10, and sorry if you hear the dog barking. There's probably someone at the door. Knocked out, or not knocked out, the top 10 ended up being Oscar in first, George in second, Lando in third, Max in fourth, Lewis in fifth, Charles in sixth, Isaac in seventh, Kimmy in eighth, Yuki in ninth, and Alex in 10th. So that was qualifying.
All right, we are going to get into the race now. For the race, there was a lot. Obviously, it's a whole race. 56 laps instead of 19 this time. Okay, so right at the start, George actually does have a pretty decent start. So just to remind you, the starting order is Oscar, George, Lando. And so, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so Oscar has a really good start. George has a pretty good one as well. But George is so worried about trying to get to the inside line to try to get past Oscar that Lando actually gets around him.
Mm-hmm.
And so it ends up being Oscar, Lando, then George. I think there were a few people that had a rough start. I think a few people tumbled down the order a little bit.
Oh, okay, yeah. So the two Ferraris made contact pretty quickly.
Yes. So that was, I think that was in...
That was in the first lap. I think
it was in the first lap, and Charles's
turns.
front wing, like end flap, basically, end plate, just gone. And part of his front wing was just sagging the whole time. I am genuinely shocked that the FIA did not call them in to fix that, because he's driving around with a broken car, basically, and they did not get a penalty. I'm surprised that they weren't required to change it when he came in to pit.
I'm curious to see, because it did seem to also help Charles's performance. At least like it wasn't hurting it.
It was giving him more downforce.
So I am curious to see if they're gonna like use it and change things with their front wing based off of it. But Charles, what ended up happening though was he ended up getting oversteer and he clipped Lewis, doing a bit of damage, but I don't think much happened to Lewis's car, and I don't think he realized for a while.
Bortoletto also spun out a little bit into gravel, I think it was, during lap 1, and so he dropped back drastically. And when you look at the times, he dropped back like 45 seconds behind the whole grid, which was really upsetting for him. Both of the Saubers, honestly, had a really rough day.
Yeah.
It was not a good race for them.
Max also went down to 6th.
Yes.
During all this.
Yes.
So overall, just a lot of movement. Luckily, it was, besides Charles and a few like spin outs, there wasn't any like mega crashes or anything.
Yeah, which is good. By the time we hit lap 6,
lap 3, Oscar already has a 1.1 second lead at this point, so we're seeing him walk away. And then at lap 4, Pierre says that Alonso's brakes are on fire.
Yeah, and it was funny, the commentators were like, and we have other drivers reporting on other drivers now. And then Fernando on the radio was like, brakes, I don't have brakes, they're not working. By the time it hits lap 6, Fernando goes in and DNFs, which means 2 DNFs in 2 races, which is not really a great start to the year for him. He's got many more years left in him, probably, so I don't think that it's too big of a deal at the end of the day. It's also the first 2 races. Who knows if he doesn't DNF for the rest of the season, then he's probably fine, because knowing every other car, they'll probably DNF. Everyone will probably DNF once.
Yeah.
I think I just jinxed that.
Anyways.
We're going to have a race where everybody DNFs. That would be crazy.
I don't know if that would even happen.
I don't know. Okay. At this point, people are starting to talk about their tires. So most people had started on mediums. There were a few people at the back that had started on hards. The general consensus was that this was going to be a 2-stop race. It's 56 laps. People's tires were struggling with 19 laps on them in the sprint race. And so everybody thought that they were going to be doing a 2-stop race.
It was not a 2-stop race.
No.
For most.
And so Williams gets on the radio and asks Alex like how his tires are feeling and like what their plan
Because
is.
at this point, I think Pierre was the first person to go into the pits. He was like one of the first. And then
He went in at lap 11. This was
yeah,
right before this.
and then slowly more and more people go in, but Alex is talking to his engineers.
And he's like, "No, I am comfortable. This is good. We're good. I'm comfortable. I'm very, very okay." And
he even said he's like, "I'm better than everyone." Something like that.
He was nursing those tires, and he was the first person where it was like, oh, he's doing a one stop. From the words that he's saying right now, he's doing a one stop. And eventually George Russell says on his radio, like, I think we can do a one stop. And then when he said that, like a lap later, he went in to change tires, and everybody was like, huh, it's a little early to get new tires for a one stop. But that was a little bit later on, I think. He ended up stopping.
Yeah, I definitely think everyone was waiting to see who the first people later on. Everyone was waiting to see who the first people to make a two-stop was, and it just didn't work out, but we'll get to that.
Well, and what we ended up hearing from the commentators was that towards the end of the race, when most people were on hards that were now 20 or so laps used, and they if you switched onto new hards, it would only gain you like 0.6 of a second faster on every single lap. And you had to make it past traffic as well. And the speed of most cars was like, it wasn't really going to help you to change your tires, to be honest. And then the mediums were going to give you an extra second on every single lap. We obviously saw that changing your tires did not really help people drastically in the end if they did a two-stop. Lap 11 is when Pierre finally went into the pits. Lap 12 is when we see Yuki, Esteban, and Jack Doohan in for the pits. Then we see Kimi and Isaac next lap. And this is when we see Yuki successfully undercut Kimi.
Mm-hmm.
So Yuki, honestly, justice for Yuki. Bro has gone through it the last two races. He's gotten screwed with the strategy in the end.
Yeah.
But this time he undercut Kimi. He was having a fantastic drive. He was in the top 10. He was doing great. I just wish that he had been able to stay there. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. Oscar was finally went into the pits at lap 15. At this point, a bunch of people had gone in as well.
He pitted before Lando, too.
Yeah. They finally gave him the priority pit strategy.
Yeah, but he had a 3.8 second pit stop.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you win some, you lose some. Do you remember when Lando got passed by George? I don't remember.
I can't remember. It was when Lando pitted.
Okay, yeah. Lando was able to take the place back from George.
It was like lap 16 or 17. Lando finally went into the pit. George had already pitted, I believe. Stroll had not.
Yeah.
Stroll was a menace.
And Alex hadn't. Alex was in the lead for like 2 laps.
Yeah. And Lando comes out of the pit right as Stroll and George are right there. And they both have their tires warmed up, and Lando's are not obviously up to temperature, and so George is able to pass Stroll and Lando. Lando's trying to fight past them. Lando eventually passes Lance, and then eventually passes George down the road. But Stroll was definitely putting in like a fight there, which he had the right to do because it's not like they were lapping him.
Yeah.
And I honestly, like, hats off to Lance. He had a pretty good race weekend, I'd say, for him.
Yeah, I said this to you.
He's quiet.
They're just so, I just forget about
I never
them.
see interviews with him.
Yeah. I forget about them. I'm sorry.
Aston Martin just doesn't, I feel like they don't, I don't know.
They're under the radar.
I just feel like they're never there.
Yeah.
Okay. Lap 21 is when Alex finally pitted, and I honestly expected him to go a little bit longer on the mediums in this, but he ended up going in.
He was also being, like, walked on pretty heavily. And so it was, like, at that point, I think just, like, the degradation it was just getting so much
Yeah,
worse.
because Oscar had passed him, and then now Lando had passed him as well. And at that point, George was starting to catch up, and so he ended up going in to get new tires. And he ended up going in to get new hards. So, okay, the Lewis and Charles stuff. So this is where the context was not given. So basically, Lewis was ahead of Charles for a good chunk of the race, and they were right next to each other. Like, there was only a second between them, really, and Charles was driving a little bit faster than Lewis.
Because of his damaged front wing.
Don't even get me started on that. And so Charles is like, can I get ahead? Blah, blah, blah. And the part that they didn't show you was Lewis was like, yeah, when I think I'm going to let Charles pass because I'm struggling a little bit.
Yeah.
And they didn't give that to us on the broadcast, but they did show Lewis, like, different clips of Lewis being like, oh, like, not yet, like, I'll let him pass when I'm ready. And
Yeah,
they
like,
made
he
it
needs
seem
to
like
speed up.
they made it seem like Lewis was, like, not allowing Charles to pass.
Yeah.
And so I don't really know what to believe. That's why I feel like I need to watch a driver's driver cam and just listen to their radio sometimes, which we'll do next time. So, but eventually Lewis let Charles pass, and Charles was able to move faster. Very interested to see if they change their front wing now because of that.
Yeah, I'm also just curious to see. I mean, at the end of the race, like, Charles was asked about it, and he's like, our friendship's great, and, like, no doubt about that, but I am just curious to see if this is going to be, like, a butting heads kind of tension between the two drivers.
We all knew it would be.
Yeah, it's no surprise. I'm just curious to see how far it will go.
Yeah. Okay. And then now we see, so Ollie had pitted earlier on. No, Ollie hadn't pitted yet. Ollie and Lance Stroll are the last two that had not pitted.
Because they started on hards.
Yeah. And so Ollie is, like, feeling great, and he's passing all these people, and eventually he's battling with Lance, and it's several laps in a row he's trying to pass Lance, and he is unable to. And at this point, his tires are going to probably be a bit more shredded because he's trying to battle. And so it's going to take a bit more wear and tear. And so he eventually goes into the radio, and he was like, okay, we need to take action now.
And the next lap he pits.
Yeah, he pits for new tires. He pits for mediums, and then ends up going the whole rest of the race on those mediums.
Well, and he was able to climb.
Yeah,
like, he was
having a great
pass.
time.
Like, he was just, and to just see how much he was cleanly passing too.
Yeah,
definitely.
It was a great race for Ollie.
Yeah,
I think he needed this after last week. And with all the crashes
I
that
think
he had.
Haas needed this, and it was a shot.
Haas definitely needed this race weekend, 100%. It was lap 27 when Ollie finally went into the pit after obviously being very frustrated. Lando was... Now this is, like, much farther into the... No.
Well, and something that Ollie did a few times that they brought up
in his second stint.
In the post-race interview was that when he was passing people in his second stint, he would pass them and go, ciao. Like, and it was just like, these rookies just make me laugh so
I know, I love
much.
them. Lando was eventually told to use more pace and move closer to Oscar, but Lando said he didn't really want to. So this could be interpreted in two different ways. It could be interpreted as Lando being like, no, Oscar's faster than me, let him have it. But I was interpreting it as Lando didn't want to be in dirty air behind Oscar. Typically, you're going to be in dirty air between, like, about 2.5 to, like, 1.5 seconds behind a car.
And he mentioned it.
Yeah, and he was like, no, I'm okay. And then they tell him on the radio again, like, you need to move a little bit closer, like, he's gonna help you. And then eventually Lando's like, okay, we'll tell him to move faster then if you want us to like create a bigger gap. Basically, McLaren's goal was to create a big gap between
because they were scared about
Oscar
the
and Lando from George and, like, the Ferraris.
And Charles.
But they ended up being fine.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely, like, it benefited them in the long run. Like, if they hadn't decided to make that push, especially with Lando's, like, mechanical
Situation,
issues at the
yeah.
end, I don't think we would have had the finish we did.
No. Charles eventually starts to lock up and he drops back a tad. He was starting to catch up to certain people. I can't remember
He
who.
was climbing on George.
Yeah,
He was
and he
climbing on
locked
George.
up and then he just dropped back a
Yeah.
couple seconds.
And it was scary. It was making me nervous because I think there was only like 4 seconds between Lando and George at this point. And I was like, if Charles is able to walk, like, what is this? One, what is this front wing doing? And two, like, how quick is he going to be able to walk on Lando? But then, yeah, he backed up and it was like 5.5 seconds.
Yeah.
That ended up creating.
Liam Lawson finally went in at lap 31 for a second pit stop. He was the first person, I believe, to pit a second time.
And I think he was the first of 3.
Yeah, there was only a few.
It was a Red Bull strategy. It was both V carbs. And
no,
then
first of 4. Liam,
four,
both
okay.
V carbs, and then Lewis. At least those are the people that I was paying attention to.
Yeah.
I think the Saubers might have gone in twice. I can't remember 100%. Lance Stroll, who nursed his tires for so long, finally went in to change his tires at lap 37. So he went 37 laps on those tires, which now that I look at it, so many drivers went that long for their second stint if they just had a one stop and they stopped at like lap 12 for new tires. It was crazy how long people were making their tires last. That's not normal.
Yeah.
Then finally, lap 46, this was a funny radio message. Charles's race engineer, Brian, tells him to, at turn 2, that's where he's losing some time and where his tires are starting to grain a bit. And they tell him to not use so much. I think the engineer was like, try not to use so much curb in turn 2. And Charles' response was, no, thank you.
Yeah. He had another one in the middle of the race where he was like, he sounded so defeated, and he was like, "You've told me 15 times already." Like,
it's just funny that the dynamic between the Ferrari race engineers and their drivers between last race and this race, like, they're both trying to tell their drivers how to drive the car rather than just being like, you're slow at this turn. Clearly, Charles knows why he's slow at that turn.
Charles in the post-race interview explained it in a way I've never thought about it. And he was like, when you're working with Italians love to talk. Like, Italian culture, they talk a lot. So we're always talking and it's emotional. And I never thought about it that, like, it's an entire team of Italian men.
It's probably such a change from Lewis going from British people to Italians.
British with an Austrian. Like, yeah, I'm like, so it makes sense why there's so much more, like, passion and, like drama
emotion
between, like, Charles and it's culture.
Lap 46, we see Yuki's front wing just have a wing failure. It just broke with the air. Just snapped in. Yeah. And so he had to go in to get a new front wing. And Yuki was like, my front wing is broken. From what?
Well, because the other thing was who was he battling with? He was battling with someone.
I think Pierre, maybe?
And all of a sudden it was like, how did it look like someone, like, punched a part of the front wing?
It was so random.
Yeah.
And so he had to go in and obviously change a front wing. And so then he obviously just tumbled down the order. Then finally, towards the very end, we find out that Lando's brake pedal is what they said it was going long. So he kept on talking with his race engineer, and to my understanding is that basically he was going to have to push the brake pedal down more for the same action to be done with the brakes. And
I think it was like, from everything they were talking about, it almost just seemed like the brakes were going out rapidly. Like, when your normal civilian car like, it gets squishy and you need to replace your brakes in your car.
And you have to, like, press harder on your brake pedal in order for it to actually stop.
They were just gone.
I think he was like this close to brake failure, basically.
And That's what Zach
And
Brown
this was like the
alluded
last
to.
6 laps or so, and they're like, you need to not use so much brake pressure. Like, you need to nurse this to the end. And he had about 8 seconds between him and George in P3.
It just went so fast.
And the last
6 seconds.
2 to 3 laps, he had to drive so slow around certain turns, and just in general drive so much slower that, like, it was a drastic difference.
Yeah, and I really do think that Zach Brown was right, like 2 to 3 more laps, not even 1 to 2 more laps.
George would have passed him.
Lando's car would have gone into a barrier. I think the timing.
That was my fear, that Lando's car, he was going to have a brake failure, and he was going to go straight
especially with
into...
the freaking final turn, the final 2 turns.
Yeah.
So, but luckily he was able to...
He got very lucky.
To not lose the second position.
And then the last thing to mention before we go into our final thoughts is Jack, towards the very end, did get a 10-second time penalty because he forced Isaac off track. It was just I think it was in the hairpin turn. Rookies, Jack going wide, trying to defend, forced Isaac off track. Typical move.
Yeah.
So. Okay, we are going to go into our final thoughts. The final order of the race was...
different than what it...
Well, yes. So, give some context before we go over the final order. After the race, typically, you park your cars in Parc Ferme, and the FIA will sometimes they'll do all the cars, sometimes they'll just do a few at random. They will review, it's called scrutineering. They will review parts of the car to make sure that everything is up to the standard regulations of the F1 to make sure of fairness.
Yeah, they did the same thing in rowing. They would we would have to weigh the boats.
Yeah,
like
it's
that.
Pretty standard for a sport,
Any sports.
To be honest. And this is something that we've seen happen in the past. Lewis's car, his skid plate was 0.5 millimeters too short. So this happened to Lewis in Austin 2023. So basically your skid plate is underneath the car. It's not actually wood anymore. I think it's like carbon fiber or something. And basically it breaks down throughout the race because you're skidding on it skids on
curbs. They're very low.
And so it's expected that it's going to break down a bit. And so the team has to try to figure out the right
height of the car to make sure that the car's high enough off the ground. And I'm sure there's significantly more complicated aspects, but...
And so Lewis's broke down a bit more than it should have. And so he ended up getting disqualified because of that. This is exactly what happened to him in Austin 2023. Charles's car was 1 kilogram underweight. This is actually not unexpected because it was an unexpected 1-stop race where they had expected a 2-stop. So if it had been a 2-stop, there would not have been as much graining on his tires at the end of the race, and so his car probably would have been the correct weight.
And made, don't want to make the joke.
And made weight, to be honest.
No, I was going to say, maybe if it had the full... No.
Well, yes, and his front end plate was gone, and so with that, plus not with a 2-stop, he probably would have been able to make weight. But he only stopped once, so there was a lot more graining on the tires, so the tires were a lot more broken down, and then he had no front end plate, and so because of that, he was underweight. And then Pierre's car was also disqualified because it was also underweight, like Charles's car. Don't know how much it was underweight, but that I know it was underweight. So that means 3 disqualifications. This is the first time ever that 2 Ferrari teammates, both Ferrari cars, were disqualified in the same race.
75 years of F1.
This was also just not a great way to end their weekend. They started it pretty great, and then this happened.
I mean, thank God they got friggin' points in the sprint.
Yeah, and so now Ferrari is in 5th in the Constructors' Championship,
with
which is
Williams
crazy.
in 4th!
Williams is killing it right now. And so with that, a lot of people's a lot of people's places shifted in the order because originally Lewis and Charles had finished in the top 10. And so because of that, I'm going to read through all 20 for you so that you know. And also remember, Fernando Alonso DNF'd, so that is 4 cars that are no longer in contention for spots in the race. P1, Oscar Piastri. P2, Lando Norris. P3, George Russell. P4, Max Verstappen. This was one of the moves that was moved up. At this point, P5, Esteban Ocon. P6, Kimi Antonelli. P7, Alex Albon. P8, Ollie Behrman. P9, Lance Stroll. And P10, Carlos Sainz.
Yeah.
So we got double Haas
and
double Williams points. There were 4 teams that got double points, which was McLaren, Mercedes, Haas, and Williams. Never in my life did I think that I would say that. Usually it's Ferrari and Red Bull instead.
Crazy.
P11 was Isaac Hadjar. P12 was Liam Lawson. P13, Jack Doohan. P14, Gabriel Bortoleto. P15, Nico Hulkenberg. And P16, Yuki Tsunoda. And then the disqualifications and the DNFs. So quite a crazy ending to the race.
It's, I remember when it was added to the calendar and I was so, iffy about this race, but this race has slowly become one of my...
It's a fun race.
Fun. And I think it's just so, the track is so different than anything else that we have.
And it's got so many fun turns, too, and really fun areas for passing. Yeah. I think it makes for a really good battle race.
And that's the thing, too, I think, so we had the main F1 coverage on, and then in the corner of the screen we had the live track of the map. And I will say, for, the first, I feel 20-ish laps, it was tight.
Yeah.
Everyone was together, and it did separate out after pit stops and spin-outs and other issues. But I do feel like everyone, obviously, has been right. It is a tight year this year, and you're seeing it in I feel the beginning of the races really well represented.
Yeah.
Now, we are still seeing, gaps, I think it was it was, a handful of seconds that Oscar was in the lead by.
Yeah.
Granted, he didn't have mechanical issues to our knowledge, but, yeah, McLaren's fast, and I'm curious to see how Ferrari's going to come back. I mean, we've got a race in, 2-ish?
2 weeks. Next weekend, there's no race.
Yeah. So... I'm just curious to see what all the teams are gonna bring. I'm curious to see whose upgrades are gonna be good, because I do feel we're slowly gonna start to see changes, and I'm so excited for some teams.
So this was, even though Carlos had a difficult race weekend, he did get points in the end because of the disqualifications. So he obviously got P10, like I said, and people pointed out that his first time on getting podium with McLaren was after a disqualification, and then his first points with Williams is after a disqualification, and so he had a very good run at McLaren, and I think that hopefully maybe this is a harbinger of good.
Oh, I'm sure. I feel we've had a few already.
Yeah, so I'm happy that they were able to get double points. This is probably the best that knocking on wood. This is so far probably the best start to a season Williams has had in years.
Yeah, it's exciting to see what they're doing, and I don't know. It's just, I think you really have to look at leadership and the way he's been able to change the team, and
I think you also have to look at a teammate pairing, not just having two great drivers, but also the atmosphere that those teammates create together. Basically what Alex has inferred, that last year he kind of really struggled to perform to the best of his abilities because of essentially the lack of performance of the car, the
length of time, the amount of years that he was with Williams at that point, and things hadn't improved. And I think for him it was a little defeatist.
And at that point, you had a teammate who was crashing every single race weekend. There was no money to improve the car because of the number of crashes. Like, it was a difficult pairing for him. I'm sure that him and Logan got on pretty well, but it probably makes it hard for you as a teammate when, like, they can't improve your car because your teammate keeps crashing.
Yeah, and I also think that there's just, like, when you're down in the dumps, it's hard to get out. And I worry about teams like Sauber for the next few races just because it's, like, so you need some bit of positivity.
Yeah.
At least a little bit. And when you're just constantly, the vibes aren't good, the drama with Logan, who knows what conversations were happening behind closed doors, knowing that they're chasing after Carlos last year. I'm sure it was anything but exciting and happy.
No. Yeah.
And I don't blame anyone. Like, I think that was just, they were in a really rough spot. And I think every team on the grid has been in a really rough spot before. And it's taken some teams years to get out of. And I think, luckily, Williams has done a good job. I think they've rebuilt themselves in a way that would make the Williams family, and I think it has made the Williams family really proud.
Yeah, I agree.
You know, because I think, you know, if you've seen any interviews with Claire, you know, there's such a pride from that family and this team that they've built, that her dad built. And, I hope it just continues on the up and up for a lot of people.
Another team that had an outstanding weekend in the end was Haas.
I know, yeah.
They needed this after last weekend. Last weekend was a rough weekend for them.
It was nerve-wracking. The last weekend I felt like, was the expectation of their showing from the beginning of last year. Based off what Io had said, I think everyone would have believed that this was their first race in 2024.
Yeah.
But, I mean, the other thing is, it's just like Lewis said, it's 2 new drivers with a brand new team. Like, there is going to be a little bit of, like, growing pains.
Yeah.
So, excited to see that they were able to, like, really improve.
And they're able to really pass, too. Like, Ollie was having the time of his life passing people.
There's definitely an impressive movement in the car that I hope they're able to, like, really, like, fine-tune.
I'm hoping that when they do bring updates, it'll just continue.
Well, I think it really it goes to show you, too, like, people are always talking about, like, the top 10, the middle of the pack, the bottom of the pack, but, like, this also goes to show you that, like, a team like V-Carb and a team like Haas and Williams that were normally towards the bottom, you know, are pushing towards the top of the middle.
Yeah.
And, you know, but then we've seen teams like Aston Martin who were at the top at the beginning of the season and then just tumble down. So, upgrades, car improvements, the season's always changing. It's exciting to see what's 100%. Next.
All right. Well, I think that's all we have for today. So please make sure to follow us on all of the things. Instagram, TikTok. Guys, I'm consistently posting on TikTok now. Y'all will be proud. Make sure to like, subscribe, everything. Just a reminder, our handle is at gforcespodcast on everything. So make sure to check us out. Bye guys.
Bye.